The people who change your life are not always the ones everyone notices. Sometimes they are the ones everyone else overlooks. Madison Carter would not understand the truth of those words until much later. On that rainy Tuesday evening, she was simply trying to survive another exhausting shift at St. Gabriel Medical Center. Before we continue, thank you for supporting the channel and spending your time with us today. Your support means more than you know. If you enjoy powerful stories about courage, kindness, and unexpected recognition, please remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing more unforgettable experiences together in future videos. Madison arrived at the hospital before dawn every morning and often left long after sunset. At 29 years old, she was one of the younger nurses in the emergency department. Patients appreciated her warmth. Families trusted her calm voice. But inside the hospital, she was rarely noticed. Administrators praised senior staff. Doctors received awards. Department leaders received recognition. Madison simply worked. She moved through crowded hallways carrying charts, helping frightened patients, answering questions, and solving problems nobody else wanted to handle. Most days, she barely had time to eat lunch. Yet she never complained. That evening, a powerful storm rolled across the city. Heavy rain pounded against the hospital windows. Ambulances arrived one after another as emergency crews responded to accidents and weather-related incidents. The emergency department became busier with every passing hour. Nurses hurried between rooms. Doctors reviewed test results. Phones rang constantly. Near the end of Madison's shift, paramedics rushed through the entrance with an unconscious older man. His clothes were soaked from the rain. He carried no identification, no wallet, no phone, no documents, nothing that could explain who he was. One of the intake clerks glanced at the chart. "Another homeless patient," she muttered. Several employees barely looked in his direction before returning to their work. To most people, he appeared completely ordinary. Just another unknown man with nowhere to go. Madison noticed something different. As the patient was transferred onto a hospital bed, she saw the exhaustion on his face. Beneath the rain-soaked clothing and unshaven appearance, she sensed someone carrying a heavy burden. She immediately began helping the medical team stabilize him. Hours passed. The man remained unconscious while doctors completed evaluations and treatment. Eventually, the emergency department became quieter. Several staff members finished their shifts and left. Madison should have gone home as well. Instead, she stayed behind to check on the unidentified patient one last time. The room was quiet except for the steady sound of monitoring equipment. The rain continued outside. Madison adjusted a blanket and prepared to leave. Suddenly, she noticed movement. The man's eyes slowly opened. Confusion crossed his face as he looked around the room. Madison stepped closer. "You are safe," she said gently. "You are in the hospital." The man studied her for several moments. He seemed surprised that someone was still there. "Why?" he asked quietly. Madison smiled. "Because you needed help." The stranger looked at her as though nobody had spoken to him kindly in a very long time. Then, after a long silence, he reached out and lightly held her wrist. His voice was weak but clear. "Do not forget my face." Madison frowned in confusion. Before she could ask what he meant, the man slowly closed his eyes again. And for reasons she could not explain, those words stayed with her long after the storm had passed. Madison Carter expected to forget the strange patient within a few days. Hospitals were full of brief encounters. People arrived, received treatment, and disappeared back into their lives. Yet something about the older man remained in her thoughts. Perhaps it was the way he had looked at her when he first regained consciousness. Perhaps it was the unusual request not to forget his face. Whatever the reason, she found herself checking his room several times over the next 2 days. The patient recovered steadily. Doctors were pleased with his progress, though they still knew almost nothing about him. He rarely spoke about himself. Whenever staff members asked questions about family or personal information, his answers remained vague. He never appeared rude. He simply seemed unwilling to share details. Most employees quickly lost interest. Madison did not. She continued treating him with the same patience she offered every patient. On the third day, she brought him breakfast shortly before her shift officially ended. The man was sitting upright for the first time. Sunlight streamed through the hospital window, replacing the storm clouds that had dominated the previous week. "You are looking much better," Madison said. The man smiled faintly. "Thanks to you." Madison shook her head. thanks to an entire medical team. The patient laughed softly. Most people would have accepted the compliment. Madison smiled and adjusted the tray table. For several minutes, they spoke about ordinary things. Weather, coffee, books. The conversation felt surprisingly natural. Yet the man continued revealing almost nothing about himself. Finally, Madison glanced at the clock. I should let you rest. She turned toward the door. Wait. Madison looked back. The man reached into a small bag that hospital staff had recovered with his belongings. After searching for a moment, he removed a simple black business card. No company logo appeared on it. No title. No address. Only a telephone number printed in silver letters. Madison looked confused. What is this? The man extended the card toward her. A way to find me someday. Madison laughed politely. I do not think I will need that. Keep it anyway. There was something unusual in his voice. Not arrogance. Not authority. Just certainty. Madison accepted the card to be polite and slipped it into her pocket. The man nodded with satisfaction. Good. You still have not told me your name, Madison said. The patient smiled again. Maybe that is better for now. Before she could respond, a physician entered the room to discuss discharge plans. The conversation ended. Several hours later, the patient officially left the hospital. No family members arrived. No friends came to collect him. He simply walked out the front entrance alone. Within a few days, life returned to normal. Madison became busy with new patients and endless responsibilities. Yet she never threw away the card. For reasons she could not explain, she placed it inside her locker. Weeks passed, then months. The mysterious patient slowly faded into memory. What Madison did not know was that far beyond the city, powerful people were searching for the man she had helped. And when they finally found him, the first question he asked was not about money, business, or personal affairs. His first question was about the young nurse who had treated him like a human being when nobody else seemed to care. Nearly 8 months passed after the mysterious patient left St. Gabriel Medical Center. For Madison Carter, life continued exactly as it always had. Long shifts, endless paperwork, emergency cases arriving at all hours of the day and night. Most weeks blended together until she could barely remember where one ended and another began. The black business card remained tucked inside her locker, forgotten beneath old notes and employee schedules. Occasionally, she would notice it while searching for something else. Each time she considered throwing it away. Each time she decided not to. She never knew why. One Monday morning, the hospital administration announced an important staff meeting. Employees from several departments gathered inside a large conference room. Rumors immediately began spreading through the building. Some people believed the hospital was receiving a major grant. Others suspected leadership changes. The truth turned out to be far less exciting. St. Gabriel Medical Center had recently experienced negative publicity after a patient complaint received attention online. Hospital executives were under pressure. Administrators wanted answers. Dr. Richard Coleman, the hospital director, stood at the front of the room reviewing reports and discussing public perception. Madison listened quietly from the back row. She disliked administrative meetings, but attended because attendance was required. As Coleman continued speaking, his frustration became increasingly obvious. Several managers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The hospital board wanted accountability. Someone needed to take responsibility for recent problems. Then the conversation unexpectedly shifted toward patient interaction records and procedural compliance. Madison barely paid attention until she heard her name. She looked up immediately. Coleman held a folder in his hand. Several months ago, he said, an unidentified patient was admitted through the emergency department. Madison felt a strange sense of recognition. Documentation shows multiple deviations from standard intake procedures. Murmurs spread through the room. Madison frowned. Excuse me, she said carefully. What deviations? Coleman glanced toward her. Additional nursing attention outside normal assignment guidelines. Madison stared at him. The patient required observation. Coleman continued reading. Extended non-essential interaction time. Unscheduled follow-up checks. Resource allocation concerns. Several employees exchanged confused looks. Even they seemed uncertain about where the discussion was heading. Madison remained calm. The patient had no family, no support system. I followed nursing judgment. Coleman closed the folder. Regardless, the hospital must maintain consistency. Madison could hardly believe what she was hearing. The patient in question had arrived vulnerable, alone, and unidentified. She had simply ensured he received proper care. Yet now those decisions were being examined as if they represented a problem. The meeting became increasingly uncomfortable. Nobody openly defended her. Several co-workers avoided eye contact. Others looked sympathetic but remained silent. Madison suddenly understood what was happening. Hospital leadership needed an example. Someone to demonstrate accountability. Someone easy to blame. And that someone was her. When the meeting finally ended, employees quietly filed out of the room. Conversations filled the hallway. Some people whispered about unfair treatment. Others simply wanted to avoid becoming involved. Madison gathered her notes and headed back toward the emergency department. Her hands remained steady, but a knot formed in her stomach. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. As she reached her locker later that afternoon, she noticed an official envelope waiting inside. The moment she saw the hospital letterhead, her heart sank. Slowly, she opened it and began reading. By the time she reached the final sentence, the color had drained from her face. Tomorrow morning, she was ordered to appear before an administrative review panel. And for the first time in her career, Madison realized her job might be in serious danger. The next morning felt heavier than any shift Madison Carter had ever worked. She arrived at St. Gabriel Medical Center before sunrise, but instead of heading directly to the emergency department, she walked toward the administrative wing. The official review panel was scheduled for 7 o'clock. Every step down the hallway seemed slower than usual. She had spent the entire night replaying recent events in her mind, trying to understand how simple acts of patient care had somehow become grounds for disciplinary action. When Madison entered the conference room, several administrators were already seated around a long table. Dr. Richard Coleman sat at the center. Thick folders rested in front of each panel member. The atmosphere felt cold and formal. Madison took the empty chair waiting for her and folded her hands in her lap. The meeting began immediately. Coleman reviewed hospital policies, compliance standards, and procedural expectations. The language sounded professional, but the outcome increasingly appeared predetermined. Every explanation Madison offered was met with another question. Every defense she presented was answered with another criticism. She calmly explained that the unidentified patient had arrived alone and vulnerable. She reminded them that nurses were trained to exercise professional judgment. She pointed out that none of her actions had harmed the patient or violated medical ethics. In fact, the patient had recovered successfully, yet her words seemed to carry little weight. One administrator briefly acknowledged her positive record, but the discussion quickly returned to concerns about resource allocation and institutional liability. Nearly an hour later, the panel requested a short recess. Madison sat alone while the administrators stepped into another room. Through the glass wall, she could see them talking quietly among themselves. Nobody smiled. Nobody appeared uncertain. A sinking feeling settled deep inside her chest. She already knew what was coming. 15 minutes later, the administrators returned. Coleman opened a document and looked directly at her. Madison Carter, after reviewing the circumstances, the panel has decided that disciplinary action is warranted. The words landed like a physical weight. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending final employment review. Madison remained silent. She refused to let them see her emotions. Coleman continued reading procedural details, but the rest of his speech blurred together. She heard words like evaluation, policy, compliance, and administrative concerns. None of them seemed connected to the reality she had experienced. She had cared for a patient. Nothing more. When the meeting finally ended, Madison stood, thanked the panel for their time, and walked out of the room. Several employees waiting in nearby offices looked away as she passed. News traveled quickly inside hospitals. By lunchtime, almost everyone knew. Some co-workers quietly expressed sympathy. Others avoided the situation entirely. Nobody wanted to challenge hospital leadership. Madison understood. Fear often made good people remain silent. That afternoon, she returned to her locker to gather a few personal items. Family photographs, a coffee mug, several nursing textbooks. As she packed her belongings, her hand brushed against something tucked near the back of the shelf. The black business card. For a moment she stared at it. The silver telephone number remained perfectly clear. She remembered the strange patient. She remembered his promise. She remembered his request not to forget his face. A small laugh escaped her lips. "I should have thrown this away months ago," she whispered. Still, she slipped the card into her purse. Then she closed her locker and walked toward the exit. Behind her, the hospital continued operating as though nothing had happened. But as Madison stepped outside into the fading afternoon light, she had no idea that somewhere far away, events were already unfolding that would change the future of everyone involved. Madison Carter spent the next 2 days trying to convince herself that everything would somehow work out. Officially, she was suspended pending final review, but deep down she already knew the hospital had made its decision. Every email she received felt colder than the last. Every conversation with human resources sounded rehearsed. Friends encouraged her to stay optimistic, yet optimism became harder to maintain with each passing hour. On Thursday afternoon, the final message arrived. Madison sat alone at her kitchen table when her phone alerted her to a new email. The moment she saw the sender, her stomach tightened. She opened the message slowly. The language was professional and carefully written. After a thorough administrative review, St. Gabriel Medical Center had decided to terminate her employment effective immediately. The hospital thanked her for her service and wished her success in future opportunities. That was all. For years of dedication reduced to a few paragraphs. Madison stared at the screen for a long time. She expected anger. Instead, she felt disappointment. Not because she had lost a job, but because she knew she had done nothing wrong. The following morning, she returned to the hospital one final time to collect the remainder of her belongings. The familiar building suddenly felt different. Hallways she had walked thousands of times now seemed strangely distant. Several co-workers greeted her warmly. Some offered hugs. Others quietly expressed regret about what had happened. Their kindness helped, but it could not change the outcome. As Madison packed the last items from her locker, she noticed the black business card again. She turned it over in her hand. The silver numbers remained unchanged. No name, no company, no explanation, just a phone number. For a brief moment, she considered calling it. Then she shook her head. What would she even say? The mysterious patient had likely forgotten her long ago. She slipped the card back into her purse and closed the locker for the final time. Several hundred miles away, in a private estate surrounded by rolling hills and guarded gates, a very different conversation was taking place. Vincent Moretti sat at the head of a long conference table reviewing reports with several trusted advisors. Despite his reputation and influence, there was one topic he continued revisiting over the years. The nurse who had helped him during one of the lowest moments of his life. Most people around him knew the story. They knew how an unknown nurse had treated him with dignity when he possessed nothing that suggested power or importance. They knew he had spent years quietly tracking her career from a distance, occasionally asking for updates while respecting her privacy. Late that afternoon, one of his associates entered the room carrying a tablet. "Sir," the man said carefully, "there is something you should see." Vincent reviewed the information. His expression immediately changed. The room became silent. He read every detail twice. Then a third time. St. Gabriel Medical Center had suspended and terminated Madison Carter. The very woman who had helped him when nobody else cared had lost her job. Vincent slowly placed the tablet on the table. "Who approved this decision?" he asked. His voice remained calm, which somehow made everyone more uncomfortable. Names were provided. Reports were explained. Internal documents were summarized. The more Vincent learned, the more disappointed he became. Finally, he stood and walked toward the window overlooking the estate grounds. Darkness had already settled across the landscape. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then Vincent turned around. "Prepare the vehicles." Several advisors exchanged confused looks. "Tonight?" one asked. Vincent nodded. "We leave before sunrise." Nobody questioned him further. Across the room, phones immediately appeared. Calls were placed. Plans were arranged. And while Madison sat alone wondering how her future had fallen apart so quickly, an entire convoy was already being assembled for the journey that would change everything. Madison Carter barely slept that night. The uncertainty surrounding her future weighed heavily on her mind. For the first time in years, she woke up without a hospital shift waiting for her. The silence inside her apartment felt unfamiliar. Usually, mornings began with alarms, schedules, and urgent responsibilities. Now there was only an empty calendar and a growing fear about what came next. Just before dawn, She sat near the kitchen window holding a cup of coffee. Outside, the city remained quiet beneath a pale gray sky. She opened her laptop and began searching for nursing positions at nearby hospitals. Every application seemed to ask the same questions. Employment history, references, reason for leaving previous position. Each answer reminded her of what she had lost. Meanwhile, several miles away, St. Gabriel Medical Center was beginning another ordinary day. Nurses arrived for early shifts. Security personnel changed posts. Maintenance crews completed routine inspections. Most employees expected nothing unusual. At 6:15 in the morning, one of the security guards standing near the main entrance noticed headlights approaching from the distance. At first, he assumed it was a delivery service. Then more vehicles appeared, and then more. Within minutes, a long procession of black luxury vehicles entered the hospital grounds. Employees arriving for work slowed their cars to watch. Nurses standing near the entrance exchanged confused glances. Nobody understood why so many vehicles were arriving before sunrise. The convoy moved with quiet precision and eventually stopped near the administrative entrance. Drivers stepped out first. Then several professionally dressed men and women emerged. They were not hospital executives. They were not government officials. Their presence immediately attracted attention throughout the building. Inside the administrative wing, Dr. Richard Coleman had just begun reviewing reports when his assistant entered unexpectedly. "Sir," she said nervously, "there are visitors here to see you." Coleman barely looked up. "Do they have an appointment?" "No." "Then schedule one." The assistant hesitated. "I do not think that will be possible." Coleman finally raised his eyes. Something in her expression made him pause. Before he could ask another question, movement outside his office caught his attention. Several unfamiliar individuals were already walking through the hallway. Employees stopped working to watch them pass. Conversations suddenly disappeared. A strange tension spread across the floor. At the center of the group walked an older man with silver hair and a calm expression. He moved confidently, but without arrogance. Those who saw him immediately sensed that he was accustomed to leadership. Coleman stepped into the hallway. "Can I help you?" The older man stopped and studied him for a moment. "You are Dr. Richard Coleman?" "I am." The visitor nodded. "Good." His voice remained polite. "We need to discuss Madison Carter." Hearing the name instantly caught everyone by surprise. Several administrators exchanged confused looks. Coleman frowned. "And you are?" The man ignored the question. Instead, he glanced around the hallway as though searching for someone. "Where is she?" Coleman crossed his arms. "Madison no longer works here." For the first time, a subtle change appeared in the visitor's expression. Not anger, not frustration, disappointment, quiet disappointment. He nodded slowly. "Then I arrived just in time." Employees listening nearby felt their curiosity growing by the second. Nobody knew who this man was. Nobody understood why he cared about a nurse who had just been terminated. But one thing was becoming increasingly clear. This unexpected visit had nothing to do with routine business. And before the morning was over, the entire hospital would learn a truth that had remained hidden for months. The hallway outside Dr. Richard Coleman's office remained completely silent. Nurses, administrators, and support staff stood frozen as they watched the unexpected visitor. Nobody knew exactly who he was, but everyone sensed his arrival carried enormous significance. The older man looked around calmly before focusing once more on Coleman. "I asked a simple question," he said. "Where is Madison Carter?" Coleman maintained a professional expression. "As I explained, she is no longer employed by this hospital." The visitor nodded slowly. "Yes, I heard that part." Several members of his team exchanged glances. One of them stepped forward and handed him a folder. The man opened it and reviewed several pages. Then he looked directly at Coleman again. According to these records, Madison Carter was terminated because she allegedly violated administrative procedures while caring for an unidentified patient. Coleman crossed his arms. "That is a simplified summary. Then perhaps you can provide a better one." Employees nearby listened carefully. Nobody wanted to miss a single word. Coleman began describing compliance concerns, resource allocation issues, and internal policy reviews. The explanation sounded official. Yet the more he spoke, the less convinced the visitor appeared. Finally, the older man closed the folder. "Interesting." His voice remained calm. "Because every independent review I commissioned reached a different conclusion." The hallway immediately grew even quieter. Coleman frowned. Independent review? Yes. The visitor nodded. I prefer facts. One administrator shifted nervously. Another quietly lowered his eyes. The visitor continued. The reports indicate that Madison Carter acted with professionalism, compassion, and sound clinical judgment. He paused. In fact, the patient involved might not be alive today without her attention. A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Coleman looked increasingly uncomfortable. And who exactly was this patient? The question seemed to change everything. For several seconds, the visitor simply studied him. Then a faint smile appeared. At last, he said, "We have reached the important part." Slowly, he handed the folder to one of his associates and stepped forward. 8 months ago, during a severe storm, an unidentified man arrived at this hospital without identification. Several employees immediately remembered the case. Most people ignored him. The visitor's eyes moved across the gathered crowd. One nurse did not. Nurses exchanged glances. Some were beginning to understand. She treated him with dignity. She stayed after her shift. She saw value in someone nobody else noticed. Coleman remained silent. The visitor continued. That patient later recovered and left this hospital. He paused again. The patient was me. Gasps echoed through the hallway. Several employees stared in disbelief. The revelation spread through the crowd almost instantly. The older man finally introduced himself. My name is Vincent Moretti. Even those unfamiliar with his appearance recognized the name. Throughout the city, Vincent Moretti was known as one of the most powerful and influential figures in business, real estate, and philanthropy. His reputation extended far beyond the region. Suddenly, everything about the convoy made sense. Everything about the visitors made sense. Coleman looked stunned. You? Vincent nodded. Yes. He glanced around the hallway. And after leaving this hospital, I spent months trying to learn more about the nurse who helped me. His expression softened slightly. Imagine my surprise when I discovered that the same woman was being blamed for doing exactly what every healthcare professional should do. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The weight of the moment settled across the entire building. Then Vincent reached into his jacket and removed a familiar black business card. Holding it up for everyone to see, he smiled faintly. I gave Madison this card because I hoped our paths would cross again someday. He looked directly at Coleman. What I never imagined was that I would return to find the best nurse in your hospital gone. For several moments after Vincent Moretti finished speaking, nobody in the hallway seemed capable of responding. The silence felt almost unreal. Nurses stood frozen beside workstations. Administrators stared at one another in disbelief. Even Dr. Richard Coleman appeared unable to find the right words. The truth had completely changed the situation. The unidentified patient everyone had dismissed as insignificant was standing in front of them. More importantly, the nurse they had blamed and terminated had been the one person who treated him with dignity when nobody else cared. Vincent calmly handed another folder to one of his associates. Please distribute these. Copies were passed among administrators and department leaders. Inside were independent evaluations, patient care assessments, and professional reviews regarding Madison's actions during his stay. Every document reached the same conclusion. Her decisions had been responsible, compassionate, and entirely appropriate. Coleman slowly reviewed the pages. The color seemed to drain from his face with every paragraph. Several board members looked equally uncomfortable. The evidence was impossible to ignore. Vincent watched quietly before speaking again. For months, I asked people to tell me about Madison Carter. His voice remained calm. Do you know what I heard? Nobody answered. I heard about a nurse who stayed after her shifts. A nurse who helped patients nobody else wanted to help. A nurse who comforted frightened families. A nurse who consistently placed people before recognition. He looked around the hallway. Yet somehow this institution decided she was the problem. The words landed heavily. Some employees lowered their eyes. Others nodded silently. Deep down, many already knew he was right. One senior administrator finally cleared her throat. Mr. Moretti, it appears mistakes may have been made. Vincent nodded. Yes, they were. His response was direct, but never hostile. That made it even more powerful. He was not seeking revenge. He was demanding honesty. Coleman finally stepped forward. For the first time since the conversation began, his confidence appeared shaken. I was unaware of certain details. Vincent studied him carefully. That is exactly the problem. The hallway fell silent again. Leadership requires understanding the people behind the reports, Vincent continued. Madison Carter was not a line item on a spreadsheet. She was a human being who dedicated herself to helping others. Several nurses exchanged emotional glances. Many had watched Madison work for years. Hearing someone articulate her value so clearly felt deeply validating. One board member turned toward Coleman. "We need an emergency meeting immediately." Others quickly agreed. Within minutes, administrators began moving toward the executive conference room. The situation had evolved far beyond a routine employment decision. Meanwhile, word spread throughout the hospital. Staff members shared the story with coworkers. Phones buzzed with messages. Departments that normally operated independently suddenly discussed the same topic. Everyone wanted to know what would happen next. Several hours later, the hospital leadership team emerged from their meeting. Their expressions revealed everything before a single word was spoken. Coleman approached Vincent personally. His posture had changed. His tone had changed. Even his expression had changed. "Mr. Moretti," he said quietly, "after reviewing all available information, we have concluded that Madison Carter was treated unfairly." Vincent said nothing. He simply listened. "The hospital intends to formally reverse its decision." A wave of relief moved through the employees gathered nearby. Coleman continued, "We would like to offer her immediate reinstatement and issue a public apology." For the first time that morning, Vincent smiled. It was not a smile of victory. It was a smile of satisfaction. The truth had finally been acknowledged. But there was still one important person missing from the conversation. Vincent glanced toward the hospital entrance and then back toward the administrators. "That is a good start," he said. "Now let us find Madison Carter and tell her ourselves." Madison Carter was sitting at her kitchen table later that afternoon when her phone began ringing. She almost ignored the call. Over the previous few days, she had received messages from recruiters, former coworkers, and unfamiliar numbers she did not recognize. But something made her answer. "Hello." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then she heard a familiar voice. "Madison, this is Richard Coleman." She sat upright immediately. Of all the people she expected to hear from, he was the last. Coleman sounded very different from the confident administrator she remembered. His voice carried a sincerity she had never heard before. "Madison, I owe you an apology." Confusion washed over her. As Coleman carefully explained everything that had happened that morning, Madison listened in stunned silence. He told her about Vincent Moretti's arrival. He told her about the investigation. He told her about the evidence. And finally, he told her the decision had been reversed. When the call ended, Madison remained motionless for several seconds. None of it felt real. Less than an hour later, another vehicle arrived outside her apartment building. This time it carried Vincent himself. When Madison opened the door and saw the older man standing there, she immediately recognized him. The years had changed his appearance, but not his eyes. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then Vincent smiled. "I was beginning to think you had forgotten my face." Madison laughed despite herself. "I almost did." Vincent reached into his pocket and held up a familiar black business card. "Good thing you kept this." They spent the next hour talking. For the first time, Vincent shared the full story of his life. He explained how he had lost everything years earlier before rebuilding his future through determination, opportunity, and the help of people who believed in him. Most importantly, he explained why he had never forgotten the nurse who treated him with kindness when he had nothing to offer in return. "You saw a person," he said quietly. "Most people only saw a problem." Madison felt tears forming in her eyes. Not because of the praise, but because someone had finally understood her intentions. The following week, St. Gabriel Medical Center held a public employee gathering inside the main auditorium. Nurses, physicians, technicians, administrators, and support staff filled the room. This time Madison walked through the entrance as an honored guest. As she entered, hundreds of employees rose to their feet. The standing ovation seemed to continue forever. Many of the same people who had watched her leave the hospital now applauded her return. Dr. Coleman stepped onto the stage first. In front of the entire staff, he publicly accepted responsibility for the mistakes that had been made. He apologized directly to Madison and acknowledged the value she had brought to the hospital for years. Then Vincent spoke. He did not talk about wealth, influence, or success. Instead, he spoke about compassion. He spoke about character. He spoke about the difference one person can make when they choose kindness over indifference. Finally, he announced the creation of a new patient assistance fund that would support vulnerable individuals receiving care at the hospital. The program would carry Madison Carter's name. The audience erupted into applause once again. Yet the most remarkable part came afterward. When offered a leadership position and special privileges, Madison politely declined. She returned to the emergency department because that was where she believed she could help people most. Weeks later, life at the hospital felt normal again. Patients arrived. Families worried. Nurses worked long hours. But one thing had changed forever. Nobody overlooked Madison anymore. Not because a powerful man had spoken for her. Not because a convoy had arrived. But because the truth had finally become impossible to ignore. And as Madison walked through the emergency department helping another frightened patient, she realized something important. Recognition was never the goal. Kindness was. The recognition simply arrived later than expected. As the day came to a close and the respect she had earned finally stood in the open for everyone to see, there was a quiet reminder that some of the strongest people in the world are often the ones nobody notices at first. Stories like this are not really about titles, uniforms, wealth, or status. They are about character. They are about the people who keep showing up, keep doing the right thing, and keep helping others even when nobody is watching. If you stayed with us until the end of this journey, thank you. Your time, your support, and your presence mean more than words can express. Every view, every comment, every shared story helps this community continue to grow. Here on The Hidden Nurse, we celebrate the overlooked heroes, the underestimated women, the quiet professionals, and the extraordinary people whose true value is often hidden beneath ordinary appearances. Our stories are built around courage, resilience, sacrifice, second chances, and those unforgettable moments when the truth finally comes to light. If you enjoy stories where kindness is stronger than arrogance, where perseverance overcomes doubt, and where hidden strength earns the recognition it deserves, then you are in the right place. The Hidden Nurse is a place for viewers who believe that integrity matters, that compassion matters, and that the people who quietly carry the heaviest burdens deserve to be seen. We are grateful for every member of this growing audience from across America and around the world. Your encouragement inspires us to continue bringing you powerful stories filled with emotion, hope, determination, and unforgettable moments of recognition. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It is a simple action that makes a tremendous difference and helps us continue creating more stories for viewers like you. Be sure to turn on notifications so you never miss a future story from The Hidden Nurse. We would also love to hear from you in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from and share what part of this story stayed with you the most. Thank you once again for listening, for supporting the channel, and for being part of this incredible community. Until next time, take care of yourselves, take care of the people around you, and never underestimate the quiet person in the room. Sometimes they are carrying a story the world has not discovered yet.